Thunder shook the roof like a giant striking the earth. Rain hissed against the boards I had cut with my own hands. My hammer rested on the beam beside me, slick with water. Not blood. Not yet. Faster, Moses, he had said. Storm or no storm. The sky answered him with a flash, and for a heartbeat the plantation looked like a skeleton. White columns, black shadows, teeth of lightning over red clay. You don't forget the sound of a whip. You don't forget the way a loved one trembles afterward. You do not forget the face of the man who calls you boy, when gray has already touched your beard. Tonight, the wind came from the west and brought a decision with it. My hands knew would weight measure. They also knew what a hammer could do when the law is a chain and mercy is a rumor. I could build a roof to keep him dry. Or I could build a moment he would never leave. Listen close. The storm is a drum. The boards are a door. And somewhere a family is praying not to be separated by a bill of sale. Subscribe, and comment your state below. Because this story isn't just history. It is weather that keeps returning. So when the thunder stops and only silence remains, what do you do with a hammer in your hand? Georgia wears two faces. In the daylight, it smiles with rows of white columns and wide porches, cotton like fallen clouds stretching to the horizon. At night, it shows its teeth, hounds in the distance, lanterns swinging, the wet slap of rain over red clay roads. The year does not matter as much as the order of things. Masters in the big house. Overseers on the horses. People in chains and cabins that lean a little more each season. The land is rich and heavy. It holds heat like a stove and secrets like a locked trunk. Summer brings storms that arrive without warning, tall and furious, then vanish as if nothing happened. When the sky breaks, the fields flatten under the water, and the rivers rise to swallow fence posts and swallow tracks. Lightning picks its victims and calls it chance. Thunder announces itself like a judge who never argues. Every sound carries farther before a storm. Nails tapping in rhythm. Bows shifting. Breath. The kind of hush you hear before a sentence is read. A plantation looks like order from the road, but step closer and you'll hear the creak of the whole structure under the weight of what it demands. Perfect crops from human hands, perfect obedience from human hearts. The ledger on the master's desk calls people assets. The Bible on his stand says we are souls. Between those books is the gap where lives fall. On Jenkins' land, the big house was painted a white so bright it hurt the eyes at noon. It sat above the quarters the way a hawk circles above a field, watching, choosing, returning. His overseer, Barrett, rode a sorrel mare that could smell fear like smoke. He carried a whip the way other men carried a walking stick. It completed his outfit. Hat, boots, cruelty. All of it looked proper to people who wanted not to see. But below the shine there was another world. Cabins stitched with hands that had learned to patch roofs from scraps, to stretch meals from nothing, to hush babies before footsteps reached the door. Old women who kept remedies in jars and stories in their mouths. Men who knew the names of every tree by the bend of its trunk and could read a river's mood by the way its surface trembled. Children who learned to be quiet when the wrong shadow crossed the threshold. Georgia weather teaches you to plan two lives. One for the sun, one for the storm. When the thunderhead stacked on the horizon, you hid what you could not lose. Letters under floorboards, a scrap of a book in a chimney hole, a small keepsake wrapped in cloth and buried under the stoop. If you were wise, you also hid your hope where no one could reach it. The storm was cover and danger at once. It made the dogs lazy but the men nervous. It blurred the line between accident and intention. It turned the night into a mask you might wear and never be recognized. The county courthouse stood 4 miles away in a square lined with wagons and gossip. People talked there about prices and politics, about new land opening and old debts closing, about sermons and railroads, about anything except the quiet arithmetic that powered it all. Bodies counted, days counted, lashes counted. In the Sunday light, you could almost believe the world was simple. But Monday always arrived, and with it the list of tasks long as the road to Savannah. Moses, the carpenter, walked those roads with a stride learned from carrying weight. He measured with his eye and cut with his ear. He could level a sill by the way a board sang when tapped. He could split a beam so the grain shone like water. For men like Jenkins that skill was a treasure. For Moses, it was a cage he decorated from the inside. The big house praised his hand, but the cabin held his heart. That is how a place breaks you, by asking your best and giving you least. Storm days were the worst and the best. Worst because the overseer's temper rose with the barometer. Best because rain could cover a whisper. In the quarters, when the wind pressed against the walls and the smoke curled low, someone might say a name like a password, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Canada, words that were both maps and prayers. Someone might draw a star in ash and say, North, or trace a river with a finger and say, Follow. The old ones frowned at risk, then warmed when they remembered being young. Georgia has a way of making you think it never changes. The same song of insects at dusk. The same cicadas rasping. The same bruised sky before a storm. But everything moves, slow as sap, sure as seasons. A boy becomes a man. A man becomes a father. A father becomes a wall against which the world will break or be stopped. And when the wind reaches a certain pitch, even the strongest oak will bend or snap. On the Jenkins place, the barn rose rib by rib under Moses's hand. Plumb lines, chalk marks, the neat language of carpentry laid across chaos. The beams went up straight even when the world did not. The longer the walls climbed, the more the sky grew dark. Somewhere beyond the treeline, someone struck iron on iron, and the sound came back doubled by the storm. Nails in a pocket. Rope on a peg. Tools set in careful order like a prayer laid out piece by piece. It is easy to mistake quiet for peace. Georgia's quiet is a waiting room. The clouds gather and pretend to be drifting. The wind changes and pretends to be playful. The people work and pretend to be unbroken. Only the river tells the truth as it swells against its banks, pressing, promising that everything that rises also falls. On that land, Jenkins's land, 2 clocks kept time. One was the brass clock on the mantel that chimed for meals and visitors and important talk. The other was the pulse inside a man who had run out of ways to swallow his rage. The first clock rang in the big house. The second beat in a chest in the barn. When storm and heartbeat align, law becomes weather. And weather does not ask permission. The county would later say it never saw this coming. But Georgia always sees. The red clay remembers every footstep. The pines keep every whisper. The sky keeps the secret until it cannot. Then it breaks it open with light. They called him the Carpenter. On Jenkins' land that title carried weight. Most enslaved men were driven into the fields, their hands blistered by cotton bolls, their backs bent under the sun. But Moses had a gift. He could take rough timber, crooked as a question mark, and cut it true. He could plane a beam so smooth it caught moonlight like water. He could raise a roof that would not bend even when the wind came howling out of the pines. Word spread across the county. Visitors to the Jenkins plantation admired the furniture in the parlor, the banisters on the staircase, the barns that stood even after storms toppled fences. Fine work, they said. Fine craftsmanship. Jenkins would smile, sip his whiskey, and nod as if he had carved every joint himself. Not once did a guest turn to Moses and speak those words directly. His labor was visible, his presence invisible. Moses was 36. Age showed in the gray in his beard, the callus on his palm, the steady patience in his movements. When he was a boy, taken from a mother whose face blurred more each year in his memory, he had been whipped for touching tools he wasn't meant to touch. But his eye never left them. What spoke to him? Every grain was a sentence, every knot a warning. His hands learned the language faster than most men could learn their letters. By the time he was 20, Jenkins knew he had something valuable. Not just another field hand. Not just another back to whip when the numbers came up short. Moses built. He repaired. He saved money for the master by keeping barns standing longer, by making wagons roll smoother, by fixing doors that slammed in the wind. In Jenkins's ledger, that meant Moses was worth more alive than dead. That fact saved him more than once. But survival is not freedom. Every nail Moses drove was a reminder. Every board he set in place for someone else's comfort pressed on him like another shackle. He built beds he would never sleep in. He carved chairs he could never sit on. He raised barns that stored cotton he would never own. His hammer rang like a hymn twisted into a chain. Sarah, his wife, sometimes touched his hand at night when the cabin was quiet and the children finally slept. "Your hands are blessed," she whispered. "God gave you a gift." Moses would nod but say nothing, because a gift without freedom is a curse with a prettier face. Still, his children adored the things he made. David, 8 years old, traced the smooth curves of a carved toy horse Moses had shaped from scrap. Naomi, 5, carried a doll with wooden arms and yarn hair that Moses had whittled by firelight. They saw their father as a magician who could turn dead wood into life. Moses saw himself as a prisoner building his own cell. In the quarters, other enslaved men envied his position. "Better to hold a hammer than a hoe," one said. "Better to work wood than bend in the fields." Moses only half agreed. Yes, his back was less sunburned, his hands less raw. But his chains were no lighter. The overseer still barked orders. Jenkins still called him boy. His children could still be sold tomorrow if profit demanded it. Skill was no shield against cruelty, only a leash tied tighter. The storm that brewed that summer seemed to know his mind. Clouds stacked like dark lumber above the fields. Thunder spoke in the same rhythm as his hammer blows. The barn rose day by day, beam by beam, each strike echoing against the sky. Neighbors praised Jenkins for his progress. None noticed the storm inside the man raising it. When Jenkins strode into the barn, boots muddy, hat tilted, and sneered at Moses's pace, it was nothing new. Faster, carpenter. Cotton waits for no man. He spat the word carpenter as if it were mockery, not respect. Moses kept his eyes lowered, his mouth shut, but his grip on the hammer tightened until the wood creaked. He thought of Sarah's laugh, soft even after years of sorrow. He thought of David's eager questions, the boy forever asking how nails hold without glue. He thought of Naomi's little fingers, braiding grass and pretending it was hair. They were his true work, the only creations that mattered. And yet they too were written into Jenkins's ledger like livestock. Moses built barns. But what he wanted was to build a life. To set beams for his children's future. To hammer nails into a house where no one could order him out. To make a table where Sarah could place food she had grown, not stolen hours to prepare for another family. Each swing of his hammer drove that dream deeper into him. Each storm cloud reminded him the world could split in an instant. Wood breaks. Chains break. Men break. But a carpenter knows. Sometimes breaking is how new things are built. The county saw him as useful. Jenkins saw him as property. His family saw him as father and husband. Only Moses knew the truth that tied them all together. His hammer was more than a tool. In his hands it could build. In his hands it could destroy. And someday when the storm chose its hour, that choice would come down with the weight of iron and the fury of thunder. Alfred Jenkins was a man who believed the world bent for him. He wore his wealth like a second skin, stitched from acres of cotton and the broken backs of men and women who bent to pick it. He walked with the gait of someone who had never feared hunger, who had never gone to bed without a roof or a meal or the assurance that tomorrow would look much like today. To his neighbors, Jenkins was respectable, even admirable. His columns were the whitest, his parlor the grandest, his wife's gowns the finest. He was invited to courthouse steps, to Sunday socials, to dinners where whiskey and politics flowed side by side. There men slapped his back and called him prosperous. They praised his barns, his stables, his fields. Few asked how that prosperity was built. Fewer still cared. But those who lived under him, those without choice, knew another face. Jenkins's temper was short, his punishments creative. He had a voice like a whip crack and a gaze that measured people as if they were tools left out in the rain. He called grown men boy and women gal. He made children fetch his boots as if fetching salvation itself. In his world, dignity was not a right, it was a luxury he withheld like sugar or salt. He surrounded himself with men who reflected his cruelty back at him, none more so than Barrett, the overseer. Barrett was not wealthy, but he carried the kind of power wealth buys. He rode through the fields with a grin too sharp for kindness, whip coiled at his hip like a serpent. Jenkins rarely dirted his own hands when punishment was required. Barrett did it for him eagerly, as though each lash confirmed his place above the people he tormented. Storms unsettled Jenkins. He disliked rain soaking his boots, wind slamming his shutters. He barked louder when the sky darkened, as if shouting could scatter clouds. On storm days when most men would postpone work, Jenkins doubled it. "Cotton waits for no storm," he would say, and Barrett's whip would underline the point. It was on such a day that his cruelty reached Sarah. A dish, nothing more than a piece of china slipped from her hands, was enough to summon fury. Mrs. Jenkins, her lips pinched thin, declared it was deliberate. Carelessness was defiance, she said. In their world, a broken plate weighed more than a broken back. Jenkins stood under the porch as rain poured, unmoved as Barrett tied Sarah to the whipping post. Lightning split the sky, but Jenkins's face did not flinch. He looked on with the calm of a man watching livestock branded. Sarah's screams rose with the storm, each lash tearing through skin and silence alike. Moses had stepped forward, dared to speak, dared to plead. Jenkins narrowed his eyes at him, voice cold as steel. "She is property. You forget your place." Then he ordered more lashes, for her and for the man who had spoken. That was Jenkins. Cruelty sharpened into routine, indifference hardened into law. He believed the world unshakable because it had always been unshaken for him. He mistook silence for obedience, bowed heads for loyalty, survival for acceptance. What he did not see, what he could never see, was the way rage gathers like clouds, how patience can rot into fury, how even the strongest oak can fall when the storm has sharpened its axe. To Jenkins, Moses was valuable but not human. A carpenter who saved him money, who made him look good to neighbors. A man he could mock, command, and threaten without thought. When whispers reached him that Moses had been scratching letters in the dirt with his boy, Jenkins's smirk widened. "Maybe I'll sell the boy," he said almost idly. "Best to break bonds early." He said it like he was remarking on the weather. But weather matters. Words fall like rain. And storms do not ask permission. Neighbors admired Jenkins's order. Enslaved men and women feared his wrath. Barrett enforced his word like scripture. Jenkins himself believed his life unshakable, his authority eternal. But on the night when thunder roared and lightning carved the sky, he walked into a storm too fierce for even him to command. Because every storm has its reckoning. And every cruel man believes, until the moment of silence, that storms only break other people's houses. The storm outside had passed, but inside the cabins another storm remained. Rain still dripped from the eaves, slipping through cracks in the roof to darken the packed dirt floor. Sarah lay face down on the pallet, her back a lattice of welts that glowed raw in the candlelight. The children huddled near her, silent, their faces streaked with tears that mingled with rain. Moses knelt beside her, cloth in one hand, water gourd in the other. Each time he touched the wounds, Sarah hissed, not from the sting of healing but from the weight of what it meant. Broken china, shattered skin, a punishment as natural to Jenkins as sipping his evening whiskey. Moses's jaw was tight, his silence a dam holding back a flood. David, 8 years old, clenched his small fists. Why they hurt Mama for a dish? His voice trembled, but his eyes were sharp, older than his years. Naomi, younger, pressed her doll against her chest as though its wooden arms could shield her. Moses wanted to answer, but truth would cut deeper than any lash. He only whispered, "Because they can." Mama Esther shuffled in, her shawl heavy with rain, her basket of herbs clutched close. She was old enough that her back bent like a bow, but her eyes burned clear. She set her things down and began to mix poultices with hands that shook only when they rested. "They gone too far," she muttered. "Whippin' a woman in a storm. That's not just cruelty, that's inviting the Lord's own wrath." She pressed leaves into the wounds and Sarah groaned, though relief followed. Moses held her hand. "Hush," he whispered. "It will heal." But both knew scars remain even after skin closes. The cabin filled with low voices once the children drifted to uneasy sleep. Mama Esther leaned close. "Storm's still here, child. Not outside, inside you. I see it in your eyes." Moses met her gaze. He had spent years perfecting the mask. Lowered eyes, calm tone, the stillness of a man who understood survival. But tonight his mask cracked. His voice came low, rough. "I can't let them do it again. The old woman nodded slowly. Storms break what's rotten. Sometimes they clear the air. Sometimes they take the whole house down. She packed her basket, eyes never leaving his face. You think careful before you raise that hammer for more than wood. Once you strike, you can't unstrike. Later, when the cabin grew quiet, Sarah stirred. Her voice was faint, each word costing her pain. Don't look like that, Moses. Don't let them see what's burning in you. They'll kill you for it. He touched her cheek gently. Then I'll hide it. But not forever. The days after the whipping moved heavy, like the air before thunder. In the quarters, whispers passed from lip to lip. Some spoke of the North, of hidden roads and safe houses. Names like Philadelphia and Canada floated like fragile prayers. Others spoke of vengeance in harsher tones, of overseers disappearing, of masters finding storms closer than they expected. Moses listened but said little. He repaired tools, fixed roofs, split wood. His hammer rose and fell in rhythm, but each strike carried a different weight now. No longer just building barns. Building anger. Building resolve. At night, when Sarah dozed in fevered sleep, Moses traced the scars on her back with his eyes, burning each into memory. Each mark was a tally in a book that could not be erased. Each mark said, "This cannot go on forever." The children learned silence more deeply. Naomi clutched her doll tighter. David began shadowing Moses, carrying scraps of wood, mimicking his hammer swings, asking fewer questions but watching more. The boy's eyes followed every move of his father's hands, as if memorizing not just carpentry but survival. One evening, as twilight bled into night and the cabins filled with smoke from cooking fires, a young field hand leaned close to Moses. "You hear?" he whispered. "They say one man up in Virginia cut down his master. Storm hit it. Folks calling him a hero." Moses's hammer paused mid-swing. He said nothing, but the word settled into him like a nail driven deep. Hero. The air in the quarters carried both fear and hope, tangled together like roots under clay. Fear of dogs, patrols, chains, death. Hope that chains could break, that storms could cover, that one act might open a door for many. Moses lay awake that night, Sarah's breathing soft beside him, the children curled against her. His hand rested on the hammer by the door. He knew its weight, its balance, the way it felt when wood gave way under its strike. But wood was not flesh. And yet, in his mind, storm and hammer and justice were already joining. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly on the horizon. Inside, the whispers grew louder, though lips barely moved. Whispers of escape. Whispers of vengeance. Whispers that a carpenter's hands might build more than barns. They might build freedom, or destruction. The storm moved on, but Moses could not. Days passed, yet the sound of the whip lingered in his ears, sharper than thunder. The welts on Sarah's back began to scab, but the memory of her screams stayed raw. When she shifted in her sleep, whimpering at the pain, Moses lay awake staring into the dark, his hand curled around the hammer beside the pallet as though it were a living thing. By day he returned to the barn. Nails lined neatly in rows. Beams angled against the half-built frame. Sawdust on his skin. To an outsider, it was ordinary labor, the rhythm of progress. To Moses, each strike was a reminder. The hammer rang not only against wood but against his heart. The sound was steady, measured, but each blow whispered, "Enough, enough, enough." Jenkins strolled through often, inspecting as if he were the craftsman. He found fault in details invisible to any eye but his own, calling Moses slow, clumsy, boy. Each insult fell like kindling on a fire already roaring. And always, Barrett lingered near, whip in hand, smirk in place, eager to remind everyone that the master's displeasure could turn into pain at any moment. When Moses returned to the quarters at night, he carried that fire with him. He would sit by Sarah's side, wiping her brow, listening to the children breathe. Her back was still raw, striped like a field newly plowed. He spoke little, but inside his chest something heavy shifted. Sarah tried to reach him with her words. "Don't let it take you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from both pain and warning. "Don't let them see you burning. They'll kill you for it." Moses only pressed her hand. He could not tell her the truth. that her suffering had already marked a line in him. A line that could not be stepped back across. One evening, when rain began again and wind rattled the shutters, Moses sat outside the cabin, the hammer balanced across his knees. He studied it as if seeing it for the first time. The head was worn smooth, the handle darkened by years of sweat. It had built barns, wagons, furniture. It had earned Jenkins money, comfort, pride. But it could also end him. Lightning split the sky, white fire that lit the yard like daylight. For a second, Moses imagined the hammer descending, striking not wood but the skull of the man who had ordered his wife whipped, who had called his children property, who had threatened to sell his son. The thought did not frighten him. It steadied him. Mama Esther's words returned, "Storm's still here, child. Not outside, inside you." She had seen the vow already forming, though he had not spoken it. He need not speak it now. The vow had carved itself into him like a groove in oak. The children sensed it too. David clung to him differently, watching his father's face as though learning not carpentry but resolve. Naomi curled close, her doll clasped tight, whispering prayers too soft for anyone but God to hear. The vow was simple: this would be the last time. The last lash across Sarah's back. The last sneer calling him boy. The last threat to his children's lives. Storms teach patience. They gather far off, building slowly, piling cloud on cloud until the air grows thick and the world holds its breath. Moses understood storms. He had built roofs that outlasted them, watched trees bend until they snapped, seen rivers rise and sweep away fences, wagons, animals. Storms came in their own time, and when they struck, nothing could stand unchanged. So he waited. He worked by day, careful to keep his mask steady, his movements precise. He bent his head when spoken to, lowered his eyes when insulted. But inside, the storm gathered, pressing harder with each passing day. Sarah healed slowly. Each night she asked if he was all right. Each night he said yes, though the truth was heavier. She sensed it. Her eyes searched his face in the candlelight, and though he smiled faintly, she whispered again, "Promise me, Moses. Don't do anything that will take you from us." He kissed her forehead but gave no promise. Because silence too can be an answer. The vow lived in that silence. In the grip of his hand on the hammer. In the way his eyes no longer saw only wood but imagined flesh and bone. In the way thunder seemed less like danger and more like a signal. Moses, the carpenter, had been building for years, barns, furniture, wagons, fences. But now he was building something else. A moment, a reckoning, a storm of his own. And when it came, the hammer would fall. The second storm came heavier than the first. Black clouds stacked like mountains over the fields, wind tearing at the cotton stalks until they bent low. The air tasted of metal, sharp with the promise of lightning. Everyone hurried for cover, everyone except Moses. He worked still on the roof of the big house, hammer ringing against shingles while the sky gathered its fury. Jenkins came to inspect the work, boots polished, voice sour. He glanced at the roof, then at Moses. "It'll do," he muttered. But his face shifted, the way it did when cruelty rose in him like bile. He leaned closer. "Barrett tells me your boy's been scratching letters. Reading. Thinks he's clever. You been teaching him?" Moses froze. David's small hands in the dirt, tracing crooked letters. "Yes." His son's eager voice asking, "What comes after D?" "Yes." His wife's worried glance, afraid of just this moment. "Yes." But Moses kept his eyes low. "No, master." Jenkins's smile was cold. "Lies." Barrett caught him. "Boy said your name. Maybe we sell him. Best to break young ones early." The storm cracked overhead, lightning so close it split a tree at the edge of the yard. Rain poured in sheets, drumming on the roof Moses had just repaired. His hammer hung heavy at his side. "You won't touch my son," Moses said quietly. The words slipped out before he could cage them. They cut through the storm like steel. Jenkins blinked, disbelief flashing into rage. "What did you say, boy?" Moses lifted his eyes and met the master's gaze. To look a white man in the eye was rebellion enough. To defy him outright was suicide. Yet Moses's voice did not waver. "You won't touch him." The whip snapped across his cheek before the words had faded, leaving a burning line of fire. Moses did not flinch. Jenkins raised the whip again, but this time Moses's hand shot out and caught his wrist. The bones ground together under Moses's grip, Carpenter's strength forged by years of wood and iron. Jenkins gasped, the sound swallowed by thunder. Fear flickered in his eyes, the fear every master carried deep down, the fear of the day a slave would stop bowing. "Let me go," Jenkins hissed, struggling. But Moses held firm. His silence was heavier than the storm, heavier than the whip. Slowly, deliberately, he twisted Jenkins's arm behind his back. The master stumbled, sputtering curses, spittle mixing with rain. Moses clamped a hand over his mouth and forced him forward off the porch, across the yard, toward the barn half swallowed in shadow. The storm covered everything, the pounding of boots on wet clay, the ragged breath of a man dragged like cattle, the hammer knocking against Moses's belt. The quarters were shuttered, families huddled inside, pretending not to hear what they already knew. Storms were cover, storms were judgment. Inside the barn, shadows swung with every flash of lightning through the gaps in the walls. Moses shoved Jenkins to the ground. The master scrambled, wet hair plastered to his face, shouting threats drowned by thunder. "You whipped my wife for a dish," Moses said, voice calm, measured. His hand found the hammer. "You threatened to sell my son for learning letters." He stepped closer, the tool glinting as lightning split the sky. "What would you do to me for this?" Jenkins's bluster faltered. He backed against a beam, eyes wide now, seeing not a carpenter but a storm made flesh. "Moses, listen," he began, but his voice cracked, swallowed by fear. "Think about your family. If you do this, they'll kill you. They'll." Moses lifted the hammer. He had built barns with it, raised beams with it, carved beauty with it. But in that moment, the hammer was no longer a tool of craft. It was judgment. It was every lash on Sarah's back, every tear in his children's eyes, every insult spat at him across the years. The first blow landed on Jenkins's temple, sharp and final. The master cried out once, then fell silent. Rain hammered the roof above them. Wind howled through the open beams. Thunder rolled like a drum of war. Moses struck again and again, each blow an echo of pain turned into vengeance. When it was over, the barn was quiet except for the storm. Moses stood breathing hard, rain dripping from the holes in the roof, hammer slick with more than water. His chest heaved, but his eyes were steady. The storm had come. And with it, a reckoning no master could command away. The barn smelled of wet hay and fresh-cut pine. Rain poured through the gaps in the unfinished roof, spattering the dirt floor into mud. Jenkins lay still now, his fine coat soaked dark, his boots streaked with clay. The hammer hung heavy in Moses's hand, slick with blood and rain. For a long moment he simply stood there, chest rising and falling, thunder rolling like a verdict. He half expected lightning to strike him down, for God himself to split the sky and call him sinner. But no voice came. Only the steady drum of rain, as if the heavens were washing away what had just been done. Moses moved quickly. Years of carpentry had taught him efficiency, order. He dragged Jenkins's body to the far stall where the flooring was only half laid. Beneath it, a shallow trench had been dug for tools and seed. It was not meant for men. But tonight it would serve. He pulled up planks, the nails screaming against the wood. Each board lifted clean, his own handiwork betraying its secrets to him. The storm outside roared louder, covering the sound. He lowered the body into the space, face slack, eyes half open. For an instant, the dead man seemed to watch him still. Moses covered the stair with straw. One by one, the planks went back into place. His hands moved automatically, precise and practiced. Nail, strike, seal. It was the same motion he had done 1,000 times, but never like this. Every blow of the hammer sealed not only wood but the silence of the grave. When the last board was set, Moses stood back. The floor looked whole. No blood showed on the grain. No trace remained but the pounding in his chest. The barn itself seemed to sigh, its ribs creaking under the wind. It had been built to hold cotton and corn. Now it held a secret. He wiped the hammer on straw and rainwater until it gleamed dull again. He placed it back in his belt, the same as any other workday. But the weight was different now. It was no longer only a tool. It was a weapon baptized in storm. Lightning flashed, throwing his shadow long across the boards. For a heartbeat, it looked like the shadow of another man, taller, heavier, unbroken. Moses felt the difference in his bones. He was no longer just the carpenter. He was something the ledger could not count, something Jenkins had never believed possible. A man who had turned his craft against the hand that owned him. Outside, the storm began to ease. The thunder grew distant, the rain softer. The wind slowed to a restless murmur through the trees. Moses stepped out into the yard, water dripping from his beard, his shirt plastered to his skin. From the cabins no one stirred. Families stayed inside when storms raged, shutters drawn, prayers whispered. If anyone had seen, no voice called out. Silence covered him as surely as the clouds. The big house windows glowed faintly, but no one looked out. Mrs. Jenkins, likely pacing, worrying over her fine china, her missing husband's absence not yet a question. Barrett, likely drinking, waiting for orders. The search had not begun. And if the storm did its work, perhaps it never would. Moses walked back toward his cabin, careful, steady, his face composed. Inside, Sarah stirred at the sound of the door. She winced when she moved, pain still sharp in her back. "You're late," she whispered. He crouched beside her, touched her hand. "The work took longer," he said simply. His voice carried no tremor. The vow had been fulfilled, but the truth was buried deeper than the boards. He lay down beside her, the children curled nearby. For the first time in years, sleep came not as exhaustion but as decision. His eyes closed with the storm still echoing in his ears, and for once the thunder did not frighten him. It sounded like applause. In the morning, the sun broke over wet fields. Birds called as if nothing had happened. Barrett cursed at the damage in the corn rows. Mrs. Jenkins asked after her husband's whereabouts, irritation in her voice but no alarm. Moses carried his hammer to the barn, walking the same path as always. The boards creaked beneath his boots, innocent as any timber. Neighbors would come. Questions would rise. But for now, silence was his ally. The storm had built him a grave and hidden it in plain sight. And the carpenter walked on, his face a mask, his secret nailed beneath the boards he himself had laid. The storm left the land raw. Trees split, fences toppled, fields beaten flat. But the greatest damage could not be seen from the road. Alfred Jenkins was gone. At first, no alarm rang. Mrs. Jenkins assumed her husband had ridden out before the worst of the weather, taking shelter at a neighbor's estate as he sometimes did. She busied herself with scolding servants for failing to dry her gowns fast enough. Barrett cursed at broken branches in the yard, muttering that the master would be furious when he returned. But as hours turned into a day and a day into two, questions sharpened. The sorrel horse still stood in the stable. No tracks marked the wet clay road. Jenkins's boots remained by the door. It was as if the storm had swallowed him whole. Neighbors arrived with concern wrapped in curiosity. They joined Barrett in searching the woods, the creeks, the ravines swollen with water. Lanterns swung through the night, dogs sniffed at the ground. The storm had washed everything clean. Every print, every trace. Men shook their heads, muttered about missteps in swollen rivers, about lightning striking too near. Barrett, though, was not satisfied. His eyes narrowed each time they passed the barn. He had a nose for secrets like a hound starved too long. Still he found nothing. The boards Moses had laid held firm, hiding their burden with carpenter's precision. The overseer spat in frustration. "Slippery ground," he growled. Storm washed him away. In the big house, Mrs. Jenkins took to her bed with nerves. Servants tiptoed past her door, whispering of madness, of omens, of a curse laid on the family. She clutched a Bible but found no comfort. In the quarters, a different whisper rose. Men and women bent low in the evening, voices hushed, glances darting toward shadows. The storm took him, some said. The Lord's hand struck him down. Others leaned closer, lowered their voices to threads of sound. "No storm," they said. "The carpenter." They looked at Moses differently. Not openly, never openly. But in the glances held a question, and in the question, a story began to take root. The hammer became more than iron and wood. It became a tale retold by firelight. He built a grave with the same hands that built the barn, one whispered. Buried the master under his own boards. Another swore they had seen lightning strike just as Jenkins vanished, as if heaven itself had passed the tool. Truth did not matter. Rumor was stronger. Rumor carried faster than dogs, traveled lighter than patrols. By the week's end, slaves on neighboring plantations had heard. A carpenter's hammer had turned from tool to weapon, from symbol of labor to symbol of vengeance. For the enslaved it was more than gossip. It was oxygen. Proof that even the most valuable master could bleed. Proof that storms might hide more than broken trees. For years people had spoken in fear, about chains, about dogs, about men hanged from trees. Now they spoke with a new edge in their voices. About storms. About hammers. About silence. Barrett pressed harder, eyes darting to Moses as if trying to peel back his calm. "You seen him last?" he asked one morning, voice casual, too casual. Moses bent over a beam, hammer striking steady. "He came to inspect, then walked on," Moses said, the words flat, the rhythm unbroken. Barrett studied him long, spit in the dust, then rode away. But suspicion is not proof. And proof was buried beneath boards too well laid. Over time the searches thinned. Neighbors returned to their fields. Mrs. Jenkins wept in her parlor, certain her husband lost to the swamp or the wrath of God. Barrett muttered still, but even his voice lost its edge. A missing master was a tragedy. But Cotton did not wait and the world moved on. Yet the quarters did not forget. The whispers grew stronger, carried by travelers, folded into songs. A hammer fell in Georgia, one line went. A storm carried the sound. Children whispered the rhyme when overseers turned their backs. Old men nodded, eyes alight. Hope often hides in stories. And in that county, a new story had been born. The tale of the Georgia Carpenter, the man who built more than barns. He built silence over a grave. He built fear in the hearts of masters. He built courage in the whispers of the enslaved. The hammer lay at his side still, ordinary in its weight. But in the mouths of others, it had already become myth. And myths, once spoken, cannot be nailed down. They travel. They spread. They grow. The land pretended nothing had changed. Cotton still waved in the breeze, the big house still gleamed in white paint, Barrett still rode his mare with the whip dangling like a second tongue. But everyone knew. Jenkins's absence sat like a stone at the center of the plantation. Mrs. Jenkins grew frantic, pacing her parlor, muttering of curses. Barrett grew sharper, barking orders, doubling watches. And Moses kept building. He fixed fences, mended wagons, raised beams. His hammer rang steady, betraying nothing. Yet every strike whispered the truth only he knew. The master was beneath the barn floor, nailed into silence. Whispers thickened in the quarters. Some looked at Moses with fear, others with quiet reverence. Mama Esther caught his eye one evening as dusk gathered. She beckoned him close, her pipe glowing in the shadows. "It's time," she said softly. "Storms cleared your path." She spoke of a meeting place, of men and women who guided runaways through swamps and woods, from creek to creek, station to station. She told him of the North Star, of hidden safe houses where candles lit behind shutters meant shelter. "3 nights from now," she said. "Dark moon. John'll have the carriage ready. You take your family. You run." John, the groom, confirmed it in a whisper as he brushed down the horses. "I'll leave the small carriage by the willow at the creek. Food packed, wheels greased. You ride till dawn." His eyes searched Moses's face. He didn't need to ask what had happened to Jenkins. The silence was answer enough. The next days dragged like chains. Barrett prowled restlessly, snapping at every worker, his suspicion unspoken but burning. He searched the barns again, stomped across the floorboards that held his master's body, but found nothing. "Storm took him," men muttered. Barrett's eyes said otherwise. At night, Moses prepared. Sarah stitched small bundles, bread, dried meat, a knife, a blanket. David and Naomi watched with solemn eyes, too young to understand fully, too old not to sense danger. Sarah whispered, "Are you sure?" Moses touched her scarred back. "Yes." The night came moonless, heavy with the scent of rain yet to fall. They slipped from the cabin after midnight, Naomi asleep against Sarah's shoulder, David holding Moses's hand tightly. The quarters lay silent, though Moses felt eyes behind shutters, watching, blessing, hoping. At the willow by the creek, John waited with the carriage. "Follow the water north," he instructed. 5 miles, then turn at the lightning-struck oak. Someone will meet you. He gripped Moses's hand hard. "Go. Don't look back." They climbed in. The horse moved quietly, wheels muffled on damp earth. For the first time in years, the cabin shrank behind them, fading into shadow. Each turn of the wheels carried them further from bondage, closer to the unknown. But freedom is never simple. Before dawn, hoofbeats thundered behind them. "Barrett." His voice carried on the wind. "Stop. You'll not take my master's property." Torches flared like small suns in the darkness. Moses's heart pounded. He urged the horse faster, but the carriage was no match for Barrett's riders. The children clung to Sarah, fear wide in their eyes. Moses's mind raced. He could not outrun them. He pulled the reins sharply, guiding the carriage toward a narrow path in the woods. Branches scraped, roots jolted the wheels. Behind, curses and whips cracked. "They're closing in," Sarah gasped. Moses made a choice. He pulled the horse to a halt near a thicket. He turned to Sarah, voice low but firm. "Take the children. Go on foot. Follow the path. Someone will meet you." Sarah's grip tightened on his arm. "No. We stay together." "If we stay together, we're caught," he said. His eyes held hers, steady, unyielding. "I'll draw them off. You keep them safe." Tears cut through the dirt on her cheeks, but she nodded. Together they lifted Naomi down, then David. Moses embraced them fiercely, memorizing their warmth. "Be brave," he whispered. "Follow your mama. Keep north." Then he turned the carriage, slapped the reins, and sent the horse crashing back toward the riders. Barrett shouted in triumph, thinking he had cornered his prey. He did not see Sarah slipping into the shadows, children at her side. The chase roared through the woods. Bullets cracked, splintering branches. The carriage bounced wildly, each jolt threatening to overturn. Moses clung to the reins, drawing them farther from the creek, farther from the path Sarah now followed. At last, the horse plunged into a ravine, the carriage smashing against rock. Moses leapt clear, rolling through brush, pain burning through his side. Barrett's riders galloped past, chasing the runaway horse. Hidden in the thicket, breath ragged, Moses smiled grimly. His family had a chance. The storm had hidden one grave already. Perhaps it would now hide a path to freedom. Daylight found him hidden among brambles, breath shallow, side burning where a branch had torn flesh. Barrett's riders thundered past and faded. The woods settled back into birdsong and the distant mutter of water. Moses pressed a palm to his wound, rose on shaking legs and began to move, not toward the creek where Sarah and the children had gone, but along a ragged deer path that Mama Esther had once traced on the dirt floor with her finger. "When you must vanish," she had whispered, "walk like a shadow. Let the world forget your name." By dusk, he reached a rock outcrop that curled like a sleeping animal around a small clearing. He called once softly. A figure stepped from the trees, a red scarf knotted at the throat. "You're late," the stranger said, not unkindly, but alive. Hands steady, the man, Thomas, lifted Moses's shirt to inspect the wound. "You'll live," he judged. "But you'll leave blood if you try the open road." He led Moses through a crease in the rocks to a hidden cabin sunk into the hillside like a secret. A woman met them at the door, sleeves rolled, eyes bright with worry turned to resolve. "Hannah," Thomas said, "another traveler." They worked without talk that first hour. Water boiled, cloth torn clean, herbs crushed. Pain came in waves and broke, then came again. At last, the fever loosened its grip. Moses slept. When he woke, night had spread across the rafters, and a candle licked a small flame against the dark. "Your family?" he croaked. "Safe," Hannah answered. Guided to the next station before dawn. A woman with a blue kerchief took them. "We send word ahead by sundown smoke and Sunday hymns." She Saturday, "You cannot follow them now. Barrett scours every crossing." Thomas returned with a bundle. trousers without plantation dye, a plain coat, boots not new but whole. On top papers. You'll travel as Samuel Wilson, he said. Free carpenter out of Baltimore. Say it. Samuel Wilson, Moses repeated, the name strange in his mouth, like a board not yet planed smooth. Names save lives, Hannah said. Sometimes truth must hide to reach the light. Days stacked like lumber. Moses healed. He learned routes, the creek road, the mill path, the swamp run that swallowed hoofprints whole. He listened as Thomas explained signals. A lantern in the east window for danger, a candle low for safe bed, a quilt with a certain pattern on the rail when watchers were abroad. He practiced how to walk like a man who belonged on the road. Chin up but not high, gaze forward but not fixed, hands never clenched. At night they spoke quietly. Thomas told of a courthouse auction where a mother's wail had split him open. Hannah spoke of her sister's marriage to a man like Jenkins and the church verses twisted to call chains righteous. They had turned their shame into work. Every soul passed forward is a brick in a bridge, Hannah said. We build what the law will not. A letter arrived, lines of cramped writing a friend read aloud. Sarah and the children had reached a house in a northern city whose name tasted like brass and snow. Work for a seamstress. A schoolroom that did not beat letters out of small hands. A bed with clean sheets and a window that looked east to morning. Hannah pressed the page into Moses's fingers. He felt the grooves where the pen had cut. He asked for ink. Thomas hesitated. Words chain as tightly as rope if they fall in the wrong hands. I know, Moses said. This one must cut me free. They wrote by candle stub. He dictated slowly, each word a nail driven straight. Tell Sarah I died. Tell the children I died for their path. Tell them grief is lighter than danger, and love is heavier than lies. Tell them the hammer that saved us cannot cross their threshold again. He signed with a hand that shook and did not add a name. Hannah set the letter in a Bible's hollow and snapped the cover shut. Mercy is sometimes cruel, she murmured. When Moses could stand without swaying, Thomas took him to the shed out back. If you are Samuel Wilson, you must be a carpenter still. He laid out tools, saw, square, chisel, plane. Moses lifted the hammer last. Its balance matched the one he knew as well as his own bones. He closed his eyes. The barn. The boards. The blow. He opened them again. I will use it differently, he said. They put him to work on benches for the school in the next station. A door for a couple who would hide travelers beneath their floor. A false-bottom trunk that could carry a child through a checkpoint asleep among quilts. Wood sang under his hand. Shavings curled like paper prayers. The hammer tapped not to seal a grave but to hinge a future. Word moved along the line. A steady man named Samuel who could fix a wagon wheel in a whisper, mend a shutter in the time it took a patrol to water their horses, show boys how to square a corner, and how to square their backs. When a frightened couple arrived with a baby who would not stop crying, Moses carved a small rattle from maple and rubbed lavender into its grain until the child slept. A carpenter builds what's needed, he told himself. Even silence. Thomas returned from town one evening with news carried in tavern smoke and courthouse steps. A reward notice. $500 for Moses accused of the murder of Alfred Jenkins. They'll hunt you harder than most, he said. Moses stared at the paper a long time. Then he fed it to the fire and watched the ash drift. Then I cannot go where my name lives, he answered. I will go where only my hands are known. Canada, Hannah said. Beyond their law. Beyond my children, Moses whispered. He felt the weight and accepted it. Love had asked him to kill. Now love asked him to vanish. He picked up the hammer again. It lay easy in his palm. Samuel Wilson, he said, steady now. Carpenter. And with every nail driven for a road he could not walk with his family, he built a bridge sturdy enough for them to cross the years and find him again, or to live without him in peace. Toronto winters bit sharper than Georgia storms, but Moses, now Samuel Wilson, found warmth in wood. His small shop smelled of sawdust and resin, of shavings curling like ribbons. He built chairs for neighbors, tables for churches, caskets for the grieving, cradles for the newborn. Each nail he drove was quieter than the night when his hammer struck a skull, yet every sound carried its echo. He lived in shadows, careful, patient. Papers said he was a free carpenter from Baltimore. The truth lay nailed under a barn floor in Georgia, hidden by storm and silence. But truth always finds ways to breathe. Travelers whispered of him. There's a man who fixes wagons on the road north. Strong hands, quiet eyes. They never used his name, but hope attached itself to his figure. Years passed. His children grew in freedom, though he was not there to see it. David, the boy who once traced letters in dirt, became a teacher. Naomi, who clutched a doll carved from scraps, became a woman who taught others to read and write. Sarah stitched clothes in a northern city, her needle pulling thread the way Moses once pulled nails, steady, determined, unbreakable. Letters reached him through trusted hands, never openly. They spoke of safety, of community, of grief eased by time. They believed him dead. And that was how it had to be. He read their words by firelight, tears carving lines through the sawdust on his cheeks. To protect them, he let them mourn him. To love them, he let them live without him. But his work continued. He became a quiet station on the Underground Railroad, offering shelter in his cabin's back room. Runaways lay on beds he built, ate at tables he crafted, held cups he carved. He never spoke of Jenkins, never of the barn, never of the storm. But the hammer always hung on the wall, polished, waiting. Some swore it glowed when lightning split the sky. The years stretched. The country burned itself into war, chains breaking by fire and by law. Moses did not return south. His grave, when it came, lay in Canadian soil, marked by both names. Moses Jenkins, born enslaved. Samuel Wilson, carpenter. The stone bore one line beneath: he built more than houses. He built freedom. And yet, long before the stone weathered, the story had already outlived him. In Georgia, whispers endured. The tale of the carpenter who buried his master beneath a barn. Children passed it in rhyme: hammer fall, thunder call, master gone, storm took all. Some swore the boards in that barn still creaked differently, as if remembering the weight they hid. Others swore lightning struck it more often than any other building in the county. Among the enslaved, his story was a lantern, proof that even one man could strike back. Among the free, it became parable, how tools of oppression could become weapons of liberation, how storms could cleanse as well as destroy. Even overseers muttered when storms gathered, eyes darting toward barns, toward hammers, toward shadows moving at the edge of fields. Fear itself was legacy. And for his family, when years later David found him in Toronto, standing in a doorway with the carving Thomas had given him, it was more than legend. It was reunion, blood made whole after decades of fracture. Sarah's name returned to his lips as prayer, Naomi's laughter returned like music. Freedom had carried them far apart, but love, stubborn as oak, carried them back. This was the legacy of the Georgia Carpenter. Not only a hammer swung in rage, but boards nailed in hope, stories whispered in firelight, children taught to read in secret, families stitched back together across miles and years. His life proved storms could be more than destruction, they could be beginnings. And so the question remains, echoing still: if a hammer is placed in your hand, do you build, or do you break? Subscribe, share, and let the world know, because buried history like this still shakes the ground beneath us.